The airfield is awake before dawn, not with urgency, but with routine. Concrete stretches outward in pale strips, damp with overnight mist. The perimeter lights glow faintly, their reflections fractured by shallow puddles left behind by an earlier rain. Somewhere beyond the hangars, a windsock lifts, hesitates, then settles again, its movement slight, undecided. This is not a combat base. There are no alerts, no scramble orders, no urgency in the voices moving across the dispersal. This is a training station, operating on schedules written the day before. Clipboards are checked, fuel caps are secured, engines will be run, shut down, and run again. Everything here exists to prepare crews for flights that have not yet come. At the edge of the apron sits the aircraft. The Avro Lincoln is large, even at rest. Its long wings dominate the space around it. For engines mounted with deliberate symmetry, their dark propeller blades motionless in the cold air. The fuselage carries the familiar lines of its wartime ancestry, but it belongs to a different moment, one that is quieter, less defined, and more uncertain. This aircraft was not built for training. It was adapted for it. The Lincoln represents a transition, from total war to uneasy peace, from combat experience to institutional memory. It is heavier than the Lancaster that preceded it, more powerful, longer range. It carries improvements learned at cost, but it also carries assumptions about skill, about discipline, about margins that no longer need to be tested in combat. Today's flight is logged as routine, a training sortie, crew proficiency, handling exercises, possibly simulated emergencies. Nothing unusual appears on the schedule. The weather briefing does not raise alarms. Visibility is acceptable. Wind is present but manageable. Cloud layers sit above the training altitude. The flight will not push extremes. On paper, there is nothing to distinguish this morning from dozens before it. Engines begin to turn. One by one, the Merlin power plants catch, cough briefly, then settle into their low, steady rhythm. The sound spreads across the airfield, heavy and familiar. Ground crews step back, watching for leaks, vibrations, anything that might suggest delay. None appear. Inside the cockpit, procedures unfold methodically. Checklists are followed in order. Instruments are scanned, not hurried, not slow. The controls respond as expected. There is no sense of anticipation beyond professionalism. Training flights are repetitions by design. Their purpose is familiarity, not challenge. The aircraft taxis slowly, its mass evident even at low speed. Brakes are tested. Steering corrections are small but deliberate. From a control tower, the Lincoln is cleared for departure. The runway lies ahead, dark and long, disappearing into the low light of early morning. This is the last moment of stillness. Power is advanced. The engines respond together, their sound deepening, vibrations passing through the A-frame. Acceleration is gradual but unmistakable. The aircraft gathers speed, the runway markings sliding beneath it in steady rhythm. For a brief interval, everything aligns. Then the Lincoln lifts. Its wheels leave the ground not abruptly, but with the inevitability of weight overcoming resistance. The aircraft climbs into the pale sky, banking gently as instructed. From the ground, it appears stable, purposeful, already shrinking against the cloud-dimmed horizon. Nothing about the departure suggests danger. There are no warnings, no visible anomalies, no radio calls that break procedure. To observers below, the aircraft becomes just another silhouette joining the morning airspace, another training sortie progressing exactly as planned. But training flights carry a particular vulnerability. They exist between certainty and simulation. Crews are asked to practice failures while believing the aircraft remains fundamentally safe. They are expected to approach limits without crossing them. The difference between rehearsal and reality is often measured in seconds, sometimes less. As the Lincoln continues away from the 8th, the crash cannot be understood without understanding the moment that produced the flight. By 1950, the Royal Air Force was no longer at war, but it was not at peace in the way it had known before 1939. The Second World War had ended 5 years earlier, yet its aircraft, doctrines, and habits still shaped daily operations. Training establishments were filled with machines designed for total war, now repurposed for instruction rather than survival. The Avro Lincoln belonged to this uneasy interval. Designed during the final phase of the war, the Lincoln was intended to be the ultimate evolution of the Lancaster: longer wings, greater fuel capacity, higher service ceiling, and more powerful engines. It was meant to strike farther, higher, and with heavier loads. But the war ended before the aircraft could fully define itself in combat. Instead, it entered service as a bomber without a war, absorbed into a force searching for a new role. That role, increasingly, was training. Britain in the late 1940s faced a dilemma. The wartime generation of aircrew, those forged by operational experience, were leaving the service. Demobilization reduced numbers rapidly. At the same time, geopolitical tension was rising. The Cold War demanded readiness without providing the clarity of a declared enemy. Aircrew had to be trained quickly, consistently, and at scale, even as budgets tightened and resources were stretched. Training units were expected to do more with less. Heavy bombers like the Lincoln were used not only to maintain operational proficiency, but to train crews for aircraft that did not yet exist in large numbers. Jet bombers were on the horizon, but piston-engine aircraft still dominated the fleet. The assumption was that fundamental skills, crew coordination, instrument flying, emergency handling, could be effectively taught on large, familiar platforms. This assumption carried risk. The Lincoln was a demanding aircraft. At over 70 feet in length with a wingspan exceeding 120 feet, it possessed significant inertia. Its 4 Merlin engines delivered power, but they also required careful management, particularly during asymmetric conditions. At low altitude and low airspeed, margins were limited. The aircraft rewarded precision. It punished complacency. Training doctrine, however, emphasized repetition over novelty. Exercises were standardized. Crews practiced engine failures, instrument procedures, and abnormal configurations according to established profiles. These profiles were often inherited directly from wartime manuals, adapted incrementally rather than redesigned. The underlying belief was that experience, accumulated through hours rather than scenarios, would compensate for risk, whether added another layer of complexity. British training airspace was crowded and frequently constrained by conditions that would have grounded civilian operations. Moderate wind, broken cloud, and marginal visibility were considered acceptable for training, even desirable. Crews needed exposure to imperfect environments. Waiting for ideal conditions would have limited output beyond what the post-war RAF could afford. The result was a culture that normalized exposure. Routine flights took place in aircraft operating near the edges of their comfort zones, not because of recklessness, but because institutional momentum made it seem reasonable. Each successful sortie reinforced the belief that procedures were adequate, that margins were sufficient, and that experience would fill any gaps. By 1950, the Lincoln had already been involved in several serious accidents, many during training. Patterns were emerging, though not always formally acknowledged. Difficulties during takeoff and climb, challenges managing asymmetric thrust, and loss of control during simulated failures. Investigations often cited handling difficulties or pilot error, terms that obscure deeper systemic issues. None of this stopped the flights. The RAF's mandate was clear: produce crews capable of operating heavy aircraft under demanding conditions. The Lincoln remained one of the few available platforms that could approximate that experience. To remove it from training would have created a vacuum the service could not easily fill. So the aircraft flew. Day after day, crews climbed aboard machines designed for war and used them to rehearse peacetime proficiency. They trusted checklists refined by conflict. They relied on assumptions that had held true before, and they accepted that training, by its nature, involved risk. Risk managed through procedure rather than avoidance. The flight in question emerged from this environment. It was neither exceptional nor reckless. It was a product of doctrine, necessity, and continuity. The crew did not depart expecting danger. The aircraft did not carry known defects that would have grounded it. The weather, while not ideal, fell within accepted limits. What mattered was not a single decision, but a framework in which heavy bombers were asked to simulate failure while remaining safe, in which margins were understood in theory but tested in practice, and in which the line between training and reality was thinner than it appeared on paper. By the time the Lincoln lifted off that morning, it carried the weight of more than fuel and equipment. It carried the accumulated assumptions of a service adapting to a new world without fully leaving the old one behind. Those assumptions would soon be tested. Understanding the accident requires a dismantling of the system that produced it, not to assign blame, but to identify pressure, where it accumulated, how it interacted, and why it mattered. The Avro Lincoln did not operate in isolation. Neither did its crew. The environment, the aircraft, and the procedures formed a single, interdependent structure. When one element shifted, the others were affected. The aircraft, the Avro Lincoln, was the final piston-engine heavy bomber developed for the Royal Air Force. In many respects, it represented refinement rather than reinvention. Its lineage was unmistakable, but the changes that distinguish it from the Lancaster were not superficial. The Lincoln was larger. Its wings were longer, increasing lift and range but also inertia. Control inputs produced slower responses, particularly at lower airspeeds. The aircraft required anticipation rather than correction. Pilots transitioning from smaller or earlier types often remarked on its reluctance to forgive late inputs. Power came from 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, each capable of delivering over 1,700 horsepower. The engines were reliable by the standards of the time, but they demanded disciplined management. Throttle coordination, mixture control, and propeller pitch had to be handled precisely, especially during takeoff and climb. Asymmetric thrust was the Lincoln's defining vulnerability. With one engine failed or throttled back, the remaining 3 produced a yawing moment that required immediate and sustained corrective action. Rudder authority existed, but it was finite. Below certain airspeeds and above certain weights, control margins narrowed sharply. This was not a flaw unique to the Lincoln. It was inherent in large, multi-engine aircraft of the era. What made the Lincoln different was scale. Its mass meant that once a deviation developed, your roll or sink, it took time to arrest. In training environments, simulated engine failures were often conducted at conservative altitudes, but realism demanded that crews practice these scenarios during climb, when margins were naturally reduced. The aircraft could perform these exercises, but only if conditions aligned. The crew, training crews in 1950 were rarely homogeneous. A typical Lincoln crew included a captain with operational or instructional experience, paired with co-pilots and flight engineers still accumulating hours. Navigators, wireless operators, and gunners, though less central during training flights, were often present, adding to cockpit workload and communication complexity. Experience levels varied widely. Some crew members had flown in wartime conditions. Others had trained exclusively in peacetime, learning procedures without the context that had originally shaped them. This created subtle differences in expectation. For some, abnormal situations were anticipated. For others, they remained theoretical. Authority gradients mattered. Training flights required instructors to allow situations to develop without intervening too early. Intervention too soon undermined learning. Intervention too late carried obvious risk. The balance was difficult, and it relied on judgment rather than metrics. Cockpit ergonomics offered limited assistance. The Lincoln's instrument layout reflected its wartime origins. Critical engine and flight instruments were present but required active scanning. There were no automated warnings for loss of control, no stall protection systems. Recognition depended on perception, not enunciation. Instructors relied on observation. Students relied on cues. Both relied on time. The environment. British training airspace was unforgiving. Weather conditions were often variable and laid. Low cloud might sit beneath clearer air, obscuring visual references during climb or descent. Wind, shear, and turbulence were common, particularly near the coast and over uneven terrain. These factors were rarely considered abnormal. They were part of the training environment. On the day of the flight, conditions were not extreme. Visibility was sufficient. Cloud cover was present but broken. Wind existed but did not exceed operational limits. From a planning perspective, there was no reason to delay. But marginal conditions reduced tolerance for error. Visual cues could disappear quickly. Recovery depended on instrument discipline. Altitude mattered. Training profiles often kept aircraft lower than operational flights, both to conserve fuel and to remain within designated areas. Lower altitude meant reduced time to recognize and correct deviations. In heavy aircraft, time was the most valuable resource. The systems, procedures governed everything. Engine out drills were defined by checklists refined over years. Power reduction, identification, feathering. Each step had to be performed in sequence. Deviations were possible, but discouraged. Consistency was the goal, yet procedures assumed ideal execution. They did not account for hesitation, misidentification, or distraction. They did not adapt dynamically to weather or workload. They relied on training to compensate for complexity. Simulated failures introduced ambiguity. An engine throttled back for training did not behave exactly like a failed engine. Instruments still showed partial indications. Vibration and noise cues differed. This required interpretation, a cognitive task laid atop physical control. Instructors monitored, but they were not immune to overload. Multiple variables, airspeed, heading, attitude, engine parameters, competed for attention. Small deviations could appear manageable until they were not. By the time a situation was clearly unstable, options were limited. The Lincoln, the crew, the environment, and the procedures formed a closed system. None were inherently unsafe, but none operated with wide margins. Safety existed in balance. When that balance shifted, recovery required immediacy and precision. The flight had not yet reached its turning point, but the structure surrounding it had already narrowed the path available. The transition from routine to emergency is rarely announced. For a time after departure, the Avro Lincoln continues its climb as planned. Engine power is set, airspeed stable. The aircraft follows its assigned track, gradually gaining altitude. From inside the cockpit, the flight appears ordinary, another sequence unfolding according to expectation. The training exercise begins without ceremony. At some point during the climb, power is reduced on one engine to simulate failure. This is not an unusual maneuver. Crews are expected to recognize the condition, maintain control, and execute the prescribed drill. The instructor monitors the response, prepared to intervene if necessary. Initially, the aircraft remained controllable. A yaw develops toward the affected side, corrected with rudder. The wings remain level. Instruments show deviations within acceptable limits. From a procedural standpoint, the exercise is progressing as designed. but the margin is thinner than it appears. The Lincoln is still relatively heavy, carrying fuel appropriate for a training sortie but nonetheless substantial. Airspeed, while adequate, is not generous. Climb performance is already reduced. The aircraft responds more slowly than lighter types. Small delays accumulate. As the simulated failure continues, the workload increases. Maintaining heading requires sustained rudder input. Any relaxation allows the yaw to return. Drag increases. Airspeed begins to decay, subtly at first. The change is gradual enough to escape immediate attention. Instrument scanning competes with checklist execution. Cloud reduces external reference. Visual cues soften and then dissipate. The horizon becomes indistinct. The aircraft transitions fully to instrument flight, whether planned or not. In this raid, deviations must be detected numerically rather than visually. Recognition depends on disciplined cross-checking. At some point, the balance shifts. The aircraft begins to roll slightly toward the inoperative engine. This is a known characteristic, countered by aileron, but roll correction increases drag further, compounding the loss of airspeed. The Lincoln's large wing, effective at cruise, becomes less forgiving near its lower limits. The instructor intervenes. Power is ordered restored. The simulated failure is terminated. Throttles advance, but engines do not respond instantaneously. The Merlins require time to deliver full thrust. During that interval, the aircraft continues to lose energy. Airspeed drops below the optimal climb value. The aircraft is still flying, but the margin between controlled flight and stall is narrowing. Control inputs become heavier. The rudder approaches its effective limit. The Lincoln is now in a regime where recovery requires altitude, time, or both. Neither is available in abundance. The aircraft begins to descend. The descent is not dramatic. It is shallow at first, masked by the climb attitude. Instruments reveal the truth before the body senses it. Vertical speed trends downward. The horizon, already obscured, offers no correction. Attempts are made to arrest the descent. Pitch is adjusted. Power is increased further. But the combination of asymmetric thrust, high drag, and reduced airspeed resists correction. The aircraft inertia works against rapid change. Each response lags behind the need. The descent steepens. At this stage, options are limited. Lowering the nose risks further loss of directional control. Maintaining attitude risks an accelerated stall. The crew is forced to choose between imperfect alternatives in seconds that feel longer than they are. Ground proximity becomes critical. There is no time to climb clear of the situation. No altitude buffer remains. The aircraft continues descending, partially controlled but unrecoverable within the space available. Impact follows shortly thereafter. The Lincoln strikes the ground in a near-level attitude, still largely intact, at a speed incompatible with survival. The forces involved exceed structural limits. The aircraft comes to rest within moments. There is no explosion described in the records, no prolonged breakup in the air. The sequence is abrupt, decisive, and final. The accident has taken only minutes from the first deviation to impact. What distinguishes it is not violence, but inevitability. By the time the situation is clearly recognized as unrecoverable, the window for correction has already closed. The aircraft, the environment, and the procedures have converged into a condition from which escape is no longer possible. The training exercise ends where it was never meant to, on the ground. The aftermath begins quietly. There are no immediate conclusions, no public statements framed for reassurance. The crash site is secured, documented, and measured. Wreckage lies where momentum carried it, not widely scattered, but compressed into a confined area, consistent with controlled descent that ended abruptly. For investigators, this matters: the position of the main structure, the angle of impact, and the distribution of debris suggest the aircraft was not in free fall. Control existed, at least partially, until the end. This immediately narrows the range of likely causes. Structural failure in flight is unlikely. So is a high-speed dive. Attention shifts to sequence. RAF accident investigation in 1950 is methodical but limited by the tools of the era. There are no flight data recorders, no cockpit voice recordings. Reconstruction depends on physical evidence, procedural analysis, and inference drawn from known aircraft behavior. Engines are examined first. All 4 Merlins remain attached to their mounts. Propeller damage indicates rotation at impact, though power levels vary. One engine shows evidence consistent with reduced output prior to impact, not mechanical failure, but throttled or otherwise limited operation. This aligns with a training scenario rather than an uncommanded failure. Control surfaces are assessed. There is no evidence of pre-impact separation. Control linkages, where recoverable, suggest continuity. Trim settings are noted. Flap configuration is recorded. These details help reconstruct the aircraft state in its final moments. Weather data is reviewed. Reports confirm conditions within authorized training limits. Visibility is reduced but not prohibitive. Wind is present but steady. There is no indication of severe turbulence or sudden meteorological phenomena that would alone account for loss of control. The investigation turns to procedure. Training manuals are consulted. Engine out drills are reviewed against likely flight profile. Investigators consider how the exercise would have been initiated, monitored, and terminated. They examine the sequence required to restore full power and the time necessary for engine response. This is where margins become visible. The Lincoln's climb performance on 3 engines is adequate under certain conditions. Weight, airspeed, and configuration must align. Any deviation reduces tolerance. Instructors are expected to recognize this and intervene early, but early is not precisely defined. The findings do not point to recklessness. There is no evidence of unauthorized maneuvers, no indication that procedures were ignored. The crew appears to have followed accepted practice, terminating the simulation when control became uncertain. What emerges instead is a picture of compression, a training exercise conducted at low altitude in marginal visual conditions, in a heavy aircraft with limited asymmetric margins. The procedure itself is sound in isolation. The context in which it is applied is less forgiving. The official conclusion reflects this. The accident is attributed to loss of control during a simulated engine failure, exacerbated by insufficient airspeed and altitude for recovery. Responsibility is distributed rather than assigned. The language is careful. It avoids singling out individuals. This is typical of the period. The RAF, like other air forces, recognizes that training accidents often reveal systemic vulnerabilities rather than personal failures. Recommendations focus on modification rather than discipline. Several changes follow. Training profiles are adjusted to increase minimum altitudes for asymmetric exercises. Greater emphasis is placed on airspeed monitoring during climb. Instructors are advised to terminate simulations earlier when margins erode. These changes are incremental, not revolutionary. The Lincoln continues to serve. Training flights continue. But the accumulated effect of accidents like this one begins to reshape doctrine. Boundaries that were once implicit become explicit. Limits that were assumed become written. The impact extends beyond a single aircraft type. As newer aircraft enter service, the lessons learned are carried forward. Jet bombers will introduce new risks, but they will also benefit from a growing institutional awareness of training-induced hazards. The loss is not undone. The crew does not return. The aircraft is written off. The accident becomes a file, a report, a reference point. But within the RAF's evolving safety culture, it becomes something else as well. a case study in how ordinary procedures can fail under ordinary conditions. That is its lasting weight. The Avro Lincoln did not disappear immediately after the crash. It continued to fly, continued to train crews, continued to occupy the space between war and whatever came next. But the environment around it changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, not because of a single accident, but because of what repeated losses began to reveal. Training, it became clear, was not a neutral activity. The assumption that procedures alone could manage risk began to erode. Instructors were reminded that realism had limits. Exercises designed to build competence could also erode safety if margins were misjudged. The distinction between acceptable exposure and unnecessary risk grew sharper. In the years that followed, asymmetric flight training was revised across heavy aircraft types. Minimum altitudes were increased. Entry conditions were more tightly specified. Airspeed awareness was emphasized not as a procedural item, but as a continuous discipline. The idea that recovery could always be achieved with sufficient skill was replaced by a more cautious understanding. Skill required space. Aircraft design would eventually reflect this shift. Later bombers incorporated clearer instrumentation, improved control authority, and more explicit warning systems. While these developments were driven in part by technological progress, they were also informed by lessons paid for in training accidents, quiet losses that rarely entered public memory. The Lincoln itself became transitional in another sense. As jet aircraft replaced piston-engine bombers, the Lincoln's role diminished. It was phased out not with ceremony, but with practicality. Its legacy was absorbed into the aircraft that followed. Its lessons carried forward without its name attached. For the crew lost on the training flight, there was no such transition. Their deaths did not occur in combat. There were no enemy actions to contextualize the loss. They died performing a task considered necessary, even routine, in an institution still learning how to train safely in peacetime. That distinction matters. Accidents like this one force organizations to confront uncomfortable truths. That danger does not require hostility, that routine can conceal risk, and that experience does not guarantee immunity. The Lincoln crash stands as an example of how safety advances are often born not from innovation, but from recognition. Recognition that systems must account for human limitation. Recognition that procedures must be adapted to context. Recognition that training, by its nature, demands humility. Today, heavy aircraft training reflects these understandings. Simulated failures are constrained by altitude and configuration. Margins are explicitly defined. Risk is managed not only through checklists, but through doctrine that prioritizes recovery over realism. These changes are rarely traced back to individual accidents. They accumulate gradually, layered over time, but each layer has an origin. The Avro Lincoln training crash of 1950 is one such origin. It ends not with shock, but with consequence, a reminder that aviation safety evolves quietly, shaped by moments where control narrows and assumptions fail. The aircraft is gone. The crew is remembered in records rather than headlines, but the lessons endure, embedded in procedures that now prevent similar outcomes. In that sense, the flight continues, not in the air, but in the structure of modern aviation safety, where what was once learned too late is now learned in time.